Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you could save your life when everything else fails. You've probably stockpiled food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. You've learned how to build a fire, purify water, and maybe even treat a gunshot wound. But there's one killer you haven't prepared for, and it's already inside you, waiting for the moment when the world collapses to strike you down faster than any bullet ever could. That killer is panic, and it's already killed more prepared people than you realize. If you want to survive what's coming, you need to understand the enemy within your own mind. Subscribe now, because this knowledge separates the survivors from the casualties, and I'm going to show you exactly how to master the most dangerous weapon you'll ever face: your own psychology. The prepper community talks endlessly about gear, skills, and tactics, but here's the hard truth that most won't admit. In actual survival situations, 70% of people make fatal decisions in the first 60 seconds of a crisis, and it has nothing to do with their equipment or training. It's psychological warfare happening inside their skulls. When the adrenaline floods your system, your heart rate spikes above 145 beats per minute, and you lose fine motor control. Above 175, you lose complex motor skills. Above 200, you're experiencing what combat veterans call condition black, total cognitive breakdown. At this point, your $20,000 bug-out bag and your survival library mean absolutely nothing, because your brain has shut down the prefrontal cortex, the part that makes rational decisions, and handed control over to the amygdala, the primitive fear center that only knows 3 responses: freeze, flight, or fight. And here's what kills you: none of those responses are appropriate for 90% of actual survival scenarios. Let me give you a real example that changed how I understand survival psychology. In 2003, during the Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island, 100 people died, not from the fire itself, but from panic-induced decision-making. Survivors reported watching people trying to exit through the same door they entered, even though there were closer, less crowded exits clearly visible. They were experiencing a phenomenon called negative panic, where the brain defaults to familiar patterns even when those patterns lead directly to death. These people weren't stupid or untrained. They were experiencing a complete hijacking of their decision-making systems by stress hormones. The survivors, the ones who made it out, shared one critical trait. They maintained cognitive function long enough to assess their environment and choose an unfamiliar but effective exit route. That's not luck. That's psychological preparedness overcoming biological programming. Now think about your own emergency plans. Have you actually trained your mind to override panic responses? Or have you just memorized procedures you think you'll remember when your heart is trying to pound out of your chest and your hands are shaking so violently you can't work a simple latch? Because I guarantee you, the first time you face a real emergency, your body is going to betray every assumption you've made about your own competence. Your vision will narrow into tunnel vision, eliminating peripheral awareness. Your hearing will distort through a phenomenon called auditory exclusion, where you literally cannot process sounds your ears are receiving. You'll experience time distortion, where seconds feel like minutes or minutes compress into seconds. And worst of all, you'll lose the ability to access complex memories, meaning all those YouTube tutorials and survival manuals you've studied will be completely inaccessible when you need them most. The difference between preppers who survive and preppers who become statistics isn't their gear or even their skills. It's their ability to recognize the onset of panic and deploy countermeasures before condition black takes over. Special forces operators, firefighters, and emergency room doctors don't have different biology than you. They panic just like everyone else, but they've trained specific techniques to interrupt the panic cascade before it destroys their decision-making capability. And you can learn these same techniques, but you have to understand that reading about them isn't enough. You have to drill them until they become automatic responses that activate before conscious thought. The first technique is called combat breathing, and it's used by every elite military unit in the world because it works. When you feel your heart rate climbing, you immediately shift to a 4-count breathing pattern. 4 seconds inhaling through your nose, 4 seconds holding, 4 seconds exhaling through your mouth, 4 seconds holding. This isn't meditation nonsense. This is a neurological hack that triggers your parasympathetic nervous system, physically lowering your heart rate and blood pressure while increasing oxygen to your prefrontal cortex. Navy SEALs use this before entering hostile buildings. Hostage rescue teams use it before breaching doors. You need to use it the moment you feel panic starting, and you need to practice it now in calm situations until it becomes automatic. Because when your hands are shaking and your vision is narrowing, you won't remember to do something you've only read about. You'll only execute what you've drilled into muscle memory. But controlling your breathing only buys you time. The next step is redirecting your mental focus from the threat to the solution. This is where most people fail catastrophically. They fixate on the danger, running threat scenarios in their mind, amplifying their fear response until they're completely paralyzed. In survival psychology, this is called threat fixation, and it's a death sentence. Your brain has limited processing power under stress. Every second you spend thinking about what could go wrong is a second you're not spending on executing your escape, defense, or survival plan. The counter technique is called task fixation, where you force your conscious mind onto the immediate next physical action you need to take. Not the entire solution, not the big picture, just the next single step. Here's how this saves lives in real situations. During active shooter events, survivors consistently report that they survived because they focused on immediate actionable tasks, moving to cover, finding an exit, helping someone next to them. The victims, according to witness testimony and security footage analysis, froze while trying to comprehend the totality of the threat. They needed to understand what was happening, why it was happening, whether it was real. That cognitive processing time killed them. The survivors didn't understand the situation any better, but they moved anyway, executing simple tasks in sequence. Door, hallway, exit, run. Each task completed became the platform for the next decision. That's task fixation, and it's the difference between action and paralysis. Now let's talk about decision-making under extreme stress, because this is where your survival plan either proves valid or falls apart completely. You need to understand something fundamental about how your brain works in crisis mode. Under normal conditions, you can weigh multiple options, consider consequences, and make nuanced decisions. Under stress, that capability collapses. You can handle maybe 2 options, maximum 3, and you need them to be simple, clear, and pre-decided. If your bug-out plan has 15 steps with conditional branches and equipment checks, you will fail to execute it when your adrenaline is spiking. You'll stand there, trying to remember step 4, while the situation deteriorates around you. Effective survival planning works backwards from this limitation. You need primary plans that are so simple a child could execute them. Grab bag, exit house, reach vehicle, drive to location alpha. That's 4 steps. You can hold 4 steps in your head even when you're terrified. But you also need to pre-decide the decision points. What if the vehicle won't start? Location beta, on foot, using route 2. What if route 2 is blocked? Route 3. What if you're separated from your family? Rally point gamma at 48 hours. These aren't complex decisions. They're pre-made commitments that your panicked brain can access because they're stored as simple if-then statements. If A fails, do B. If B fails, do C. No analysis required. No weighing of options. Just execution of predetermined responses. The professionals call this decision-making framework mental rehearsal or stress inoculation. And it's how people perform impossible tasks under impossible conditions. Fighter pilots execute emergency procedures in aircraft traveling faster than sound because they've rehearsed those procedures thousands of times in simulators. They don't think through the steps. They execute pre-programmed responses while their conscious mind focuses on the variables they can't predict. You need to do the same thing with your survival plans. Walk through them physically in your actual environment until they become automatic. Drive your bug-out routes. Practice grabbing your gear in darkness. Run through your rally point protocols with your family. Not once, not twice, dozens of times until your body knows the movements and your mind can focus on the unpredictable elements of the actual crisis. But here's where it gets more dangerous, and this is something most preppers completely miss. The biggest threat to your survival isn't the initial panic of the first crisis moment. It's the psychological collapse that happens in the hours and days after, when the adrenaline fades and reality sets in. This is called the second wave, and it kills more people than the initial disaster. Because once you've survived the immediate threat, once you've reached your bug-out location or secured your home, Your brain sends you a bill for all that emergency response. You'll experience profound exhaustion, emotional numbness, decision fatigue, and something called survivor's guilt, even if you haven't lost anyone yet. This is when people make their second set of fatal mistakes, abandoning good positions, taking unnecessary risks, or simply giving up. Understanding this pattern is critical because it means you need to plan for psychological endurance, not just physical survival. The first 72 hours of any major crisis will test your immediate response capabilities. The next week will test your ability to maintain routine and discipline when everything in you wants to shut down. Military psychologists have known for decades that maintaining small routines, enforcing sleep schedules, and setting achievable daily goals are what separate functional survivors from psychological casualties. You can't just stockpile food and ammunition. You need to stockpile psychological resilience. And that means building habits now that will sustain you later. Here's what that looks like in practical terms. Right now, in your normal life, do you maintain a sleep schedule? Do you exercise regularly? Do you have coping mechanisms for stress that don't involve screens or substances? Because in a long-term survival scenario, you won't have access to your usual stress relief systems. No Netflix, no alcohol runs, no scrolling through social media to numb your anxiety. You'll have your own mind, your own discipline, and whatever coping systems you've built into your baseline behavior. If you don't have healthy stress management now, you won't magically develop it when you're living on stockpiled rice and dealing with actual threats to your survival. The most dangerous lie in prepper culture is the fantasy that crisis will transform you into a harder, better, more capable version of yourself. That's Hollywood programming, and it will get you killed. Crisis reveals who you already are. It strips away your civilized veneer and exposes your default settings. If you're undisciplined now, you'll be undisciplined then. If you panic over minor problems now, you'll panic over major problems then. The time to build psychological resilience is right now in peacetime, through deliberate practice of stress management, decision-making under pressure, and emotional regulation. You're not preparing for a weekend camping trip. You're preparing for sustained psychological warfare against your own worst instincts. And that requires training just as much as any physical skill. Let me tell you about normalcy bias, because this cognitive trap kills more prepared people than anything else. Normalcy bias is your brain's tendency to underestimate both the possibility of disaster and its potential severity. It's why people ignore evacuation orders. It's why they stay in their homes during hurricanes. It's why they don't bug out when they should. Your brain is hardwired to assume that tomorrow will be like today, that systems will keep functioning, that things will return to normal. This bias is so powerful that people will literally watch disaster approaching and convince themselves it's not really happening. During the Fukushima disaster, residents in the evacuation zone reported seeing the tsunami warning and thinking it was exaggerated. They were watching the water rise and still believing it would stop. You have normalcy bias right now. You're reading this, and part of your brain is saying that real collapse won't happen, that even if something goes wrong, it won't be that bad, that someone will fix it. That voice will kill you if you listen to it. The counter to normalcy bias is what intelligence analysts call assumption checking. You force yourself to regularly assess current conditions against your threat models without emotional attachment to the outcome. Not paranoia, not wishful thinking, just cold analysis. Are supply chains more fragile than last year? Are political tensions escalating? Are there increasing incidents of infrastructure failure? You track these indicators with the same detachment you'd track weather patterns, and you maintain trigger points, specific conditions that activate specific responses. When X happens, I do Y. No debate, no second guessing, just execution. This is how you beat the normalcy bias that will paralyze others. You don't wait until disaster is obvious to everyone. You act on predetermined indicators, even when it feels premature, even when people call you crazy. Because the worst-case scenario of acting too early is that you wasted some time and resources. The worst-case scenario of acting too late is that you're dead. The mathematics of that decision are simple, but your normalcy bias will fight you every step of the way, whispering that you're overreacting, that you should wait just a little longer to be sure. Don't listen. Trust your indicators, execute your plan, and understand that in crisis situations, early action is the only action that matters. Now, let's address something most preppers don't want to hear. Your family might be your greatest vulnerability, not your greatest strength. I know that contradicts the community narrative about survival groups and family units, but you need to hear the hard truth. If your spouse doesn't share your threat assessment, if your children haven't been psychologically prepared for crisis scenarios, if your extended family thinks you're paranoid, then you're not building a survival group. You're building a liability cluster that will compromise your decision-making and drain your resources when you can least afford it. The worst time to discover your family won't evacuate when you need to is when you need to evacuate. This doesn't mean abandon your family. It means you need to be honest about their psychological readiness and make realistic plans that account for their actual capabilities, not their theoretical ones. If your spouse has severe anxiety, that's a factor in your planning. If your children can't handle stress without melting down, that's a factor. If your parents are in denial about potential threats, that's a factor. You plan around reality, not around what you wish was true, and you start having difficult conversations now, not when the power grid fails. You build shared threat models. You practice scenarios together. You establish protocols that everyone understands and has agreed to in advance, because in the actual crisis, you won't have time to negotiate or convince. You'll need immediate compliance with predetermined plans, and that only happens if you've built genuine buy-in beforehand. The psychology of groups under stress is its own nightmare, and you need to understand the dynamics before you're living them. Small groups in survival situations tend to fragment around day 3 to 5, when the initial adrenaline wears off and personality conflicts intensify. People who seemed reasonable and cooperative will suddenly become territorial, suspicious, or controlling. Resource anxiety will trigger hoarding behaviors. Power struggles will emerge over decision-making authority. And if you haven't established clear leadership structures and conflict resolution protocols before the crisis, your group will tear itself apart exactly when cohesion matters most. This is why successful survival communities start with psychological compatibility screening, not just skills assessment. You need people who can regulate their emotions under stress, defer to leadership when appropriate, contribute without seeking constant validation, and maintain perspective during setbacks. Those traits matter more than whether someone can shoot accurately or build a shelter, because skills can be taught. But psychological stability under pressure is largely hardwired by adulthood. If you're building a mutual assistance group, spend time in stressful situations together before you need each other for survival. Go on difficult camping trips, practice your emergency protocols, see how people behave when they're tired, hungry, and frustrated. That's who they'll be when things get real. Let me tell you about the survivors I've studied, the ones who made it through actual collapse scenarios, long-term disasters, and grid-down situations. They share specific psychological traits that have nothing to do with physical strength or technical skills. They maintain emotional regulation even when situations are deteriorating. They accept reality quickly without wasting energy on denial or blame. They find purpose in immediate tasks rather than dwelling on losses. They maintain dark humor as a coping mechanism. And critically, they practice tactical patience, understanding that survival is about enduring rather than winning. These aren't personality types. These are trained responses that anyone can develop, but you have to start now. And if you want to go deeper, you'll find in the pinned comment some guides and documents that can take your preparedness to the next level, covering psychological stress inoculation, decision-making frameworks, and group dynamics under crisis conditions. Check them out when you're ready, because this knowledge could be what keeps you functional when everyone around you is falling apart. The final truth you need to understand is this: your mind will be the battlefield where your survival is decided. Everything else, your gear, your stockpile, your location, your skills, they're all just tools that your psychology will either deploy effectively or waste completely. Panic kills faster than bullets because bullets require external threats, but panic generates its own casualties from the inside out. You can survive almost anything if your mind stays functional. You can't survive anything if it doesn't. So stop obsessing over which rifle to buy or how many freeze-dried meals to stockpile and start training the most important survival tool you own: the 3 pounds of gray matter between your ears. Practice stress management. Drill emergency procedures until they're automatic. Build psychological resilience through deliberate discomfort. Learn to recognize your own panic responses and interrupt them before they compromise your decision-making. Because when everything falls apart, when the grid goes down, when the trucks stop running, when your neighbors start getting desperate, the difference between you surviving or becoming another casualty will be determined by whether you've mastered the enemy within. Don't just listen to this and move on. Act. Start training your mind today, because tomorrow might be too late. If this information mattered to you, if you understand that psychological preparedness is the foundation everything else builds on, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you're ready for what's coming. The world isn't getting safer. Make sure your mind is getting stronger.